There are a lot of people right now who are either personally and or professionally trying to figure out what they're going to do now that Broadcom is making VMware untenable to use for home labs and small to medium businesses. If you don't know what I'm talking about, refer to my video over here. Yes, that is me with a giant beard. Thankfully, there are a lot of options in terms of virtualization for your business and home lab, and as promised, we're going to start looking into comparing and evaluating them against our beloved VMware. Let's get to it. Hey there, home labbers and self-hosters, Rich here. This video is the first of probably many videos around evaluating your options if you're coming from the world of VMware and ESXi, with this video in particular being focused on XCP-ng. My background is in VMware, so I'm going to be looking at this from that perspective and give you my thoughts and opinions along the way. As we always do, I think we should start with some background on XCP-ng and the history of the product first. The origin story of XCP-ng begins with the Xen cloud platform and its commercial counterpart Citrix Xen Server. Xen Server was made open source in an effort to cut costs, differentiate itself, and compete with VMware and Microsoft, which were the dominant players in the virtualization space. However, this led to unexpected challenges. Citrix found that while users appreciated the new features of the open source enterprise product, they were less inclined to pay for maintenance and support. Go figure. This led to a decrease in revenue and a shift in Citrix's approach towards open source. By 2017, Citrix reintroduced limitations to the features available in the free version of the product. On March 31, 2018, the initial release of XCP-ng was made. This marked the official start of the project and its journey in the open source virtualization space. In the intervening years, XCP-ng saw multiple version releases evolving with new features and improvements. This period was marked by significant growth in the project's community and user base. In January 2020, XCP-ng joined the Linux Foundation via the Xen project, marking a major milestone and further solidifying its place in the open source community. The project continues to be actively developed with ongoing work on security enhancements, compatibility with new architectures like RISC-V, and integration with various technologies and platforms. Especially after the drama we've been experiencing with Broadcom, it's refreshing to see a project that's fully open sourced and unlikely to have the world turned upside down by corporate bullshit. But history aside, how does XCP-ng compare to ESXi or even vCenter for that matter? Well, let's talk about it. Let's start with architecture. Both XCP-ng and VMware ESXi are Type 1 hypervisors. However, there are key differences in their deployment methodologies. VMware ESXi is very lightweight by design, only containing a minimum footprint to function, and once booted, runs solely from RAM. All of the VMware ESXi kernel is closed source. XCP-ng is based on the Linux kernel and is also lightweight, but unlike ESXi, after the boot process loads the kernel and other necessary components into RAM, XCP-ng continues to use disk storage for various operational needs. On to performance. While performance is highly dependent on what's running in your workloads, these days, performance between the two hypervisors looks to be nearly equivalent. There are some historical reports where users have reported I/O performance issues with XCP-ng when comparing identical workloads between the two hypervisors. Now let's talk about usability. In my opinion, here's where I think ESXi easily outperforms XCP-ng. By default, every deployed ESXi host has a built-in web-based HTML5 GUI. For single-host deployments, this GUI is all you need to manage your host, build and manage VMs, vSwitches, and data stores. No extra steps are needed. In contrast, a fresh deployment of XCP-ng has no local web GUI for host management. Instead, to manage your XCP-ng host, you need to deploy Xen Orchestra. Thankfully, XCP-ng makes that relatively easy by assisting you with spinning up a VM of the Xen Orchestra appliance, also known as XOA. It's tough to compare these two management interfaces with each other for a few reasons. One, XOA is more than just a single host management GUI. Its functionality is more akin to VMware vCenter than a single host management UI that comes out of the box with ESXi. You absolutely do use Xen Orchestra to manage a single host, but you can also manage multiple XCP-ng hosts from within a single instance of Xen Orchestra, manage pools, the XCP-ng equivalent of clusters in VMware, migrate VMs between hosts, run backups, and so on. More about features next. ESXi offers a wide range of advanced features, including distributed resource scheduling, high availability, fault tolerance, vMotion, which is VMware's term for live migration of VMs, storage vMotion, and API control. However, all of these features require additional licensing to unlock. By default, the best you get with the free version of ESXi is basic VM management out of the box. In contrast, XCP-ng includes clustering, live migration of VMs, VM backup functionality, and automation via API calls, along with all the standard VM management you'd expect from a hypervisor. For the most part, with the exception of DRS, XCP-ng is nearly feature complete with the licensable features of VMware out of the box for free. Now let's talk about scalability. ESXi is very well known for its scalability and is used in some of the largest virtual environments in the world. ESXi is fully capable of managing thousands of VMs without issue, and when adding vCenter into the equation, has the ability to scale clusters of virtual hosts out to hundreds of hosts with many thousands of VMs, no sweat. XCP-ng also features scaling, but its adoption in very large or complex environments is less common compared to ESXi. Xen Orchestra has the same concept for clusters called pools and will service and manage large collections of hosts and VMs. And for the business-minded viewers, let's talk about support. VMware offers extensive professional support, training, certifications, an extremely well-maintained public knowledge base, and a large community behind it. That being said, with the changes in the new ownership of Broadcom, it's unclear exactly how that will affect product support, access to the KB, and so on. XCP-ng, being open source, relies more on community support, though professional support is available through vendors including Vates, the company actively developing XCP-ng. The community is passionate, active, and growing. And lastly, cost. Here's where the rubber meets the road, and for VMware ESXi, the most recent changes being made to licensing by Broadcom will effectively put VMware out of the reach of most people. It's very likely the reason you're watching this video now. The ESXi free hypervisor, at the time of this video at least, is still free with limitations. XCP-ng, however, is 100% free and open source, with most features available without cost. Professional support services are available for a fee, but overall it will be more cost-effective, especially for smaller pool deployments of multiple XCP-ng hosts or those with budget constraints. Alright, overview out of the way here, let's take a look at some real-world examples of the two side-by-side, along with my thoughts on both. As I mentioned earlier, XCP-ng does not have an embedded host management GUI that exists with the hypervisor, so we'll be looking at XOA in terms of comparisons where applicable, and I'll be sure to call them out as we go through them. The first stop here is to take a look at the consoles of both and compare. Here are both consoles side by side. At a glance, their layouts share similarities, but as we're going to discuss, there are big differences between the two. Let's start with the incumbent ESXi. The ESXi console provides some information about the physical host, like ESXi version information, OEM hardware manufacturer, processor type, count and speed, and RAM amount on the host, as well as the URL for web management. In terms of configuration, pressing F2 and logging into the host provides you with very basic management functionality. In essence, the most you can do is configure or change your management interface settings, enable support functionality like enabling SSH or local prompt access, enabling lockdown mode, and that's about it. Via F12, you can manage shutting down or rebooting the host itself. Outside of these basic functions, VMware expects anything beyond this to happen from within the built-in HTML5 management web GUI. In contrast, XCP-ng provides not only a wealth of information about the host, but also the ability to essentially manage nearly all aspects of the host configuration from the console. For comparison purposes, I want to point out that XCP-ng, like ESXi, provides you with the means to configure your management interface for the host, set DNS, enable/disable SSH, restart or shut down your host, and so much more. I want to touch on a few key features and options specifically to call them out. The first option that should have you asking, why doesn't ESXi have this, is the ability to see the VMs on the host and start and stop them. You can also do storage management, create, join, leave a resource pool, and get detailed information about the hardware in your host, including CPU socket, core count, speed, RAM quantity, and DIMM slot information, local storage HBA information, and BIOS and BMC version information. And lastly, VM backup and restore functionality, all from the console. XCP-ng clearly has the upper hand here with what you can do from the console of the host. As a longtime VMware user, I just can't believe all the functionality available to you. It is absolutely impressive, and honestly, I don't know why VMware didn't steal that idea a long time ago. But consoles aside, let's dig into their respective management GUIs and the differences between the two now. As I mentioned earlier, ESXi has a built-in web management console and XCP-ng does not. So on the XCP-ng side, we'll be using Xen Orchestra Appliance, or as it's known, XOA, in the comparison here, with the caveat that by the nature of these two approaches, it's not exactly apples to apples. I'll be calling out the differences as we move through this. Again, let's start with the incumbent ESXi. This is the web management UI of ESXi. Landing on the main dashboard, you're given a summary of all of your host state, usage, vSwitch and port group configs, data stores mounted and free space, system information, and at-a-glance graph of overall CPU and RAM usage on the host. On the bottom in the Recent Tasks pane are all of the active and recent tasks that are running or have occurred. On the left is your navigation pane, where you can dig deeper into your host configuration and monitor your performance, hardware, events, logs, and more. In the Virtual Machine tab, you get a full list of the running VMs on the host, details about storage usage, guest OS config, host name, CPU, and memory usage. When you drill down into a specific VM, you get health, utilization and configuration information, snapshot, and access to the console, as well as all the standard VM management functions like power, suspend, restart, and hardware configuration options. In the Storage tab, you get an at-a-glance view of your mounted data stores, their utilization and type, as well as the ability to create new data stores. Across the top, you view and manage your virtual storage adapters, devices, and so on. When drilling down into a configured data store, you view further information about the storage type, location, host connected, virtual machines connected to it, and with the data store browser at the top, browse the storage system, upload and download data, and otherwise manage the data store as desired. The last tab to touch on the web GUI is the Networking tab. At a glance, you see all of the port groups configured on your host, and drilling down into any of them provides you with detailed information about the port group, VMs connected, vSwitch that serves the group, and a visualization of how the VMs with network interfaces assigned to that port group connect to the physical network. Backing out to the Virtual Switches tab and viewing your configured vSwitches, you get an incredibly rich level of information about all virtual networks on your host, the VMs connected to them, and how they connect to your physical networks. The main networking tab is also where you can view and manage physical network adapters on your host, VM kernel NICs, TCP stacks, and firewall rules. In contrast, the XOA interface feels less polished and cluttered compared to the ESXi host management web interface. Again, it's important to note that Xen Orchestra does host management and essentially all of the management functionality of vCenter, so by its scope, it's going to have more tabs, options, and sections. This is the XOA dashboard, which gives you a basic overview of the number of pools, hosts, VMs running, RAM usage, vCPU assigned, storage used, as well as general alarm, tasks, users, and VM power state at a glance. Let's take a look at host management specifically, since that's what we were just looking at in ESXi. To manage your host, we need to head up to Home, and then we can choose from VMs, hosts, pools, templates, and storage tabs. In the VM tab, we get a basic list view of the VMs currently running on the host. Clicking on a VM allows you to begin managing that virtual machine. The first tab, the General tab, gives you a 4-line graph showing you at a glance CPU, RAM, network, and storage utilization, and a ton of unnecessary white space below. At the top, you can control your VM state with start, stop, restart, migrate, snapshot, export, and copy functions. Stats gives you better performance details of the running VM broken down by typical resource category in very clear, easy-to-read graphs. The Console tab gives you access to the running VM's console and the same 4-line graphs from the General tab. Unlike VMware ESXi, there's no ability to pop out the console of a running VM or a piece of software like the VMware Remote Console to independently have access to the console. The Network tab shows you the networks your VM is connected to and allows you to add or remove virtual network interfaces. The Disk tab shows you information about the VM's virtual disks, as well as the ability to add, delete, and attach a pre-existing disk. The Snapshot tab is kind of self-explanatory. Both XCP-ng and ESXi allow you to take snapshots, and both will allow you to snap with or without active memory. There's nuance here between the two hypervisors in terms of snapshots that I want to take a moment and discuss. When snapping without memory, both hypervisors will create their snapshots quickly without interruption to the VM being snapped. However, in XCP-ng, when you attempt to snap a VM with memory, you're presented with a warning that doing so will make the VM unusable until the snapshot is completed, which isn't something you have to worry about in ESXi. It's not a deal breaker by any means, but it's something you should be aware of if you're accustomed to making snaps with memory in VMware. The Backup tab is where you'd see the status of any backups of this particular VM. Yes, one of the biggest differentiators between ESXi and XCP-ng is a completely free, built-in, native means of backing up your virtual machines. Logs show you the log events that have occurred for the VM, of which I don't have any displayed here. The Advanced tab allows you to configure specific advanced features for your VM, like setting boot order, changing virtualization modes, enabling HA for the particular VM, selecting or changing NIC types, creating a virtual TPM device, and a ton more options. Suffice to say, you have all the same information and configurability in XCP-ng that you do in ESXi, with a far more cluttered and spread out experience. I do, however, appreciate the ability to create virtual TPMs, as that's not something available in ESXi without vCenter. Let's move on now to the host management and the host tab. Back up to Home and then the host tab, we see just one XCP-ng host I have named XCP-ng. Clicking on the host gives us the same familiar information we saw in the General tab for a VM, with the addition of a callout for the total number of VMs and a graphical bar to indicate the current RAM usage of the host. Under the Stats tab, we get the same information we saw from the stats under VM, but from a host level. In the Console tab, we can access the Xen Server hypervisor directly, which, again, coming from the world of VMware, is pretty neat. The Network tab is where you build out your network connectivity on the host. PIFs are essentially the combination of port groups and vSwitches in ESXi terminology. You can create multiple PIFs that use the same network interface as long as you configure VLANs on the PIF to segment your traffic appropriately. Compared to ESXi, XCP-ng's virtual network configuration is simpler and less complicated. Big differences here conceptually between the two hypervisors in terms of virtual network configuration. ESXi networking is a lot more complicated than XCP-ng, but it's also more extensible in configurability. I also think that the approach that VMware takes in terms of providing a visual representation of how VMs connect to virtual networks is superior to XOA's list approach. On the same tab, we also have private networks. A private network is a virtual network within the host itself and is only available internally on that host. These networks provide the flexibility of a truly segmented internal host-only network for VMs to communicate on. The Storage tab gives you a list of all of the mounted storage systems for your host. You can create new storage mounts, or in XCP-ng terminology, SRs, which stands for Storage Repository. XCP-ng supports the same SAN and NAS connectivity you'd get from ESXi for iSCSI, Fiber Channel, and NFS mounts, as well as in-host storage. Moving on, the Patches tab is where you'd be provided information about available patches for your XCP-ng host, except this feature is behind a paywall. This feature is only available in the Starter Edition and above, which is $85 a month at the time of this video. You have three options for updating your host. Pay the $85 a month for a starter license and use the XOA GUI, drop to the console of your XCP-ng host and issue a yum update command, or compile Xen Orchestra from source, something I'll talk about a bit later. Moving on, the Logs tab provides you with logs from the host, which is pretty self-explanatory, I suppose. Lastly, the Advanced tab, where we can configure advanced features for the host, as well as see more detailed host information about the hardware and so on. Our next stop is pools. A pool in XCP-ng terms is akin to a cluster in VMware. Again, remember, XOA is more like vCenter than a single host management GUI. If you had multiple XCP-ng hosts, you can collect them into pools and build out high availability clusters for your VMs, as well as live migrate VMs between hosts in the pool. This video isn't intended to do a comparison between Xen Orchestra and vCenter, though let me know in the comments if that interests you, and we can certainly do that. But I do want to stop here and just point out it is pretty damn cool that you can build a highly available pool of XCP-ng hosts with live migration and everything without any licensing costs involved. Templates are pre-configured virtual machine configurations. These templates are designed to simplify the process of creating new VMs by providing a set of predefined settings and configurations for a particular guest operating system. If you're familiar with creating VMs in ESXi, you'll remember one of the steps in VM creation is to select the operating system that will be running in the virtual machine. In XCP-ng, we see these presented differently, but the intention is the same. The last section is the storage section, not to be confused with the storage subsection under the host section. This section provides basically a list of all of the SRs or storage repositories that are attached to all of the hosts you have associated with your Xen Orchestra appliance. Clicking on one of the SRs in the list drills down into macro information like utilization, performance stats, virtual disks housed within the SR, hosts attached to it, logs, and advanced information that includes the ability to reclaim freed space, enable a maintenance mode, and remove the SR entirely. So that's a comparison of the two interfaces. Now I'm going to talk about the things that I liked, dislike, and the good and bad, again coming from my VMware ESXi perspective. Feel free to disagree with me in the comments of this video or on our Discord server. After using XCP-ng for a solid 2 weeks now and getting comfortable with all facets of host and VM management, I can say that it will effectively satisfy your needs to replace ESXi. It has all the general bells and whistles, features, and options, and honestly, a lot more out of the box, so let's talk about the things that I don't like. The first thing I want to address is the user experience. Xen Orchestra as an interface and a user experience isn't great. The first impression I had when I logged into XOA was, yep, this looks like open source, which is to say it looks a lot like many other generic open source web GUIs that I've used in the past. To make my point here, here's XOA side by side with Cockpit. You see what I'm talking about? There's so much wasted space and too many sections and subsections within them. I'm a big believer in open source, and I've seen some just incredible graphical user interfaces in open source, so it's not like this couldn't be better. And before you tell me, oh, that's such a dumb thing to complain about, it's functional and that's all that matters, you're right. It is functional, and it's ugly, and I don't enjoy using it, which is the opposite of what any UX or UI designer should want from their product. The organization of information, how it's presented, and how buried some of the sections are feels like the user experience is an afterthought. The next thing I don't like about XOA specifically is what feels like a completely irrational approach to what's available for free in XOA appliance and what's behind a paywall. Tell me why under the dashboard section, visualizations and statistics are behind a premium license, but you can dig down into pool, host, and VM levels and get stats. license. Tell me why host updates are behind a starter license paywall, but XOA updates are not. There seems like there's paywalls everywhere in XOA requiring, depending on what feature, a variety of different levels and costs. It's just annoying. Yes, you can compile an entire Xen Orchestra application from source code and then get all of those features, and I know there's even a community-built, unsupported, containerized version that you can run on it as well. That's great, but what I'm asking you here is why? If the source code is available and you can compile essentially a fully unlocked version of Xen Orchestra, and because it's open source, you're not breaking any rules doing it, then why isn't the standard XOA appliance just fully unlocked and Vates can charge a subscription for various levels of support? Because I don't know if anyone's told Vates this, but the kind of people who'd be running XCP-ng in their Homelab are the kind of people who aren't going to flinch at spinning up a container or compiling their own unlocked version of Xen Orchestra. Thankfully, this is basically where my complaints end. XCP-ng has so much going for it otherwise. Starting from the top, the sheer amount of configurability and host management you get from the console is bananas compared to ESXi. Again, seriously, I have no idea why VMware never stole that idea. You can create pools of hosts, live migrate workloads around, and enable high availability, and that's the stuff of vCenter, and it's built in. Oh, and XCP-ng has native VM backup functionality built in as well. No need to have third-party backup software to protect your workloads. Again, another thing that required a license to do in VMware. There's also the hub in XOA that provides single-click, easy-to-deploy standard VMs, and in the most recent version of XOA, they added a native in-app migration tool to migrate VMs from VMware into XCP-ng, which, for the 2 VMs I ran it against, seamlessly migrated across from my vCenter into XCP-ng without issue. So, in summation, if you are a soon-to-be ex-VMware person or company that uses VMware looking for an alternative direction to migrate to, XCP-ng has a lot going for it and is worth checking out. One last thing to note, I'll be digging into Proxmox next, so keep an eye out for that video. And that, friends, will do it for this video. If you liked it, throw us a sub and a like, and if you have a beef with anything I've said here, let me know in the comments below. Special thank you to our YouTube members. You help keep the lights on, and we thank you for it. If you'd like to help support the channel, consider becoming a member or buy some of our swag. It all helps us keep making these videos. And now that you finished watching this video, how about checking out this playlist over here of other great Homelab and self-hosting videos we've done in the past. If you're looking for your next great Homelab idea, we can help.